Hey, Grace Moms, how are you doing? Today was day one of our Read the Bible in 90-Day Challenge, and we sprinted through chapters 1 through 15 of the book of Genesis. Now, I don't know about you, but there were some really good things in there I would love to dive deeper into, and that's why I have my journal printed out to jot things down that I want to come back to. But I want to highlight a few things for you. I'm sharing a link to the Bible Project videos if you want to learn more about the history and what's going on here from a theological perspective. I encourage you to watch them. I watch them with my kids. We all love them. But right now, I want to just kind of have a little devotional time with you, if you would. In Genesis chapter 1, the story of creation, one we're all familiar with, God spoke and it happened, right? Well, I noticed a few other things in there today that I just was so fired up about. I had to share them with you before I went to bed tonight. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 10, God called the dry ground land and the water seas, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land sprout with vegetation, every sort of seed-bearing plant, and trees that grow seed-bearing fruit. These seeds will then produce the kinds of plants and trees from which they came," and that is what happened. Man, I love that. God spoke, and that is what happened. That's not even what I'm talking about tonight, but it gets me so excited. The land produced vegetation, all sorts of seed-bearing plants, and trees with seed-bearing fruit. Their seeds produced plants and trees of the same kind, and God saw that it was good. You know, God is really emphasizing through what he had Moses record in this passage for us to have access to, that these things that he created that have life produce seeds, and those seeds produce more of the same, okay? So even though we're not talking about animals or even humans, plants are living things, and this is God's purpose for living things. When we skip down a little bit further, in verse 22, God is talking about every living thing that scurries and swarms in the water and every sort of bird. Then God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply. Let the fish fill the seas and let the birds multiply on the earth." That is also a part of God's blessing. The blessing to be able to multiply, the blessing to be able to be productive, to produce. Skip down a little bit further. Verse 24, God said, "Let the earth produce every sort of animal, each producing offspring of the same kind. Livestock, small animals that scurry along the ground, and wild animals." And that is what happened. God made all sorts of wild animals, livestock, small animals, each able to produce offspring of the same kind. And God saw it was good. Now, if you skip down to verse 27, God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Then God blessed them. Again, that same blessing. "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and govern it. Reign over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and all the animals that scurry along the ground." That's the blessing. And sweet friend, what I took from this today was an encouragement for you and I. As women of faith, as children of God, as daughters of the King of Kings, as the bride of Christ, we are created in his image. And as living beings created by God, we have a purpose. We are to be seed-bearing, to produce after our own kind. And that doesn't mean simply procreate from the womb. Although as a mom of 8, I'm definitely a huge fan of life, obviously. But what this means is producing souls for the kingdom. That's what that means for us today. In Matthew 28:19, the commission that Jesus gave his followers was go and make disciples. At the end of the book of John, when Jesus gives Peter this redeeming moment after he had denied him, and he says, Peter, do you love me?" And John records that Peter says, "Well, yes, Lord, you know I do." And what did Jesus say to Peter? "Feed my sheep. Feed my lambs." He called him to once again, he wasn't worried about Peter and his wife having more babies. He was worried here about Peter producing disciples for the kingdom, about taking care of his children. And so I want to encourage you today to read these scriptures and ask God, how does this apply to your life? When I prayed that this morning, I wasn't expecting something out of the first chapter of the Bible, a story that I've known since I was probably 2 or 3 years old. But this is what God showed me. He said, Lisa Yvonne, my purpose is for you to be a seed-bearing Christian who produces more Christians, who points people to me, who fills the kingdom with souls, because I want to come back. That's what he says in the Bible. The Spirit and the bride say, come. That is our cry, sweet friend. That is the cry of the body of Christ to a lost and dying world. Come to the table. There is a God who loves you. We were created to do this. We were created to share Jesus and bring people to him. That's so exciting. And that is the blessing that God spoke over his creation. Be fruitful and multiply. What a blessing it is. And if you're a mom, you know that physical fruitfulness that we do, this parenting thing that we do, is a blessing too. But we also get to do it in a spiritual way as we lead our children to the Lord and as we lead friends and people that we barely know to Jesus. This is our calling. Now, I want to skip forward a little bit, if you would, with me. And I want to bring you to chapter 12. This is a theme that happens a lot in the Old Testament, so I want to just mention it now, and we'll talk more about it in the future, okay? But in chapter 12, verse 7, then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your descendants. And Abram built an altar there and dedicated to the Lord who had appeared to him. Verse 8, after that, Abram traveled south and set up camp in the hill country with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east. There he built another altar and dedicated it to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord. I just want to talk for a brief second about the significance here. Abram was probably the first person in goodness knows how long to worship only one God. He was from a polytheistic society where they worshiped at many, many altars, and they went to many tabernacles, and they did all of these things, and they just worshiped all these different inanimate objects as gods. And yet, Abram had an encounter that was so real that he followed this God that he didn't know to a land he'd never heard of, to accept promises he had no way of knowing would really be fulfilled. This was a man of faith, and his faith led him on a journey that was literally the founding of the Jewish race. And Abraham is our father too as Christians, because he's the father of faith, right? That's what it says in Hebrews 11. So what did our father of faith here on earth, not our heavenly father, but Abraham, teach us about this? It says he built an altar and dedicated it to the Lord who had appeared to him. That's amazing. When God appeared, he stopped and built an altar. It wasn't an altar of worship so much as it was an altar of remembrance. But at the next altar, it says he dedicated to the Lord, and there he worshiped the Lord. That was so significant for him because he was recognizing that God was the God, the only God, the true God, and he was giving him his loyalty, his faith, his reverence. Okay, now I'm flipping back here to Hebrews chapter 11, and I just want to read verse 8 to you. It was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and go into another land that God would give him as his inheritance. He went without even knowing where he was going. And when he reached the land God had promised him, he lived there by faith. For he was like a foreigner living in tents, and so did Isaac and Jacob, who had inherited the same promise. Abraham was confidently looking forward to a city with eternal foundations, a city designed and built by God. And it was by that faith that even Sarah was able to have a child, though she was barren and too old. She believed that God would keep his promise. And so a whole nation came to this one man who was good as dead, a nation with so many people that, like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, there is no way to count them. All these people died still believing what God has promised them. They didn't receive what was promised, but they saw it all from a distance and welcomed it. They agreed that they were foreigners and nomads on this earth. Well, sweet sister, what a story of faith God is giving us in Genesis and confirming in Hebrews. Just like those things created in the garden, the plants, the fish, the birds, the animals that scurry, the livestock, the wild animals, and even man himself were created to bear seeds and to produce. We see that that's the promise, the blessing. It says God blessed them and said, be fruitful, right? That was the blessing that God spoke over Abraham. You will be the father of many nations whose descendants are as innumerable as the sand on the shore, the stars in the sky. Have you looked outside tonight? In addition to a gorgeous full moon, wow, is it amazing? There are also stars that I could not begin to count. And they are less than the descendants that God gave a man who was so old he despaired of ever having children. That's amazing. The blessing that God gave Abraham was to be fruitful and multiply. And Abraham received that blessing because of his faith, because he stopped, he built altars, and he worshiped the Lord. So I want to encourage you, sweet sister, as we go through scriptures, as we sprint through these chapters, ask God for one or two nuggets. Maybe these are your nuggets. Maybe God showed you other ones. But ask him for these, because it's amazing to see this. And when we get to the New Testament and we look back about the things that we read, a couple weeks earlier, we're going to go, whoa, those connect. And we're going to see things like this. And I'm going to constantly try to show you Jesus in the Old Testament pointing towards the New, so that we can kind of get the full picture here. I hope that you are blessed and encouraged tonight, and I will talk to you tomorrow.